I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk briefly about the really complicated, complex, and ever-changing, I think, issues related to the Fort Hood shootings and how that will be played out in the legal proceedings, and also what are the big issues that reporters might want to look out for. So
there will be problems getting access to some of the legal papers related to the case. Because courts-martial are not standing courts, there's no clerk's office of the kind that members of the press and members of the public are used to in dealing with civilian, federal, and state courts. This has been a problem in the past where important aspects of the prosecution may be, or the case may be conducted on paper. There's certainly going to be a lot of motion practice in what is unfolding at Fort Hood. And I think it's going to be frustrating to try to do a professional job without regular, easy access to the motions and responses and so forth. And the government's position, this is the U.S. Army, was that you had to request the legal papers, the motions, by using the Freedom of Information Act, which is deeply frustrating and frankly silly. And I would hope that the media, and I'm thinking now not only of your organizations, but also the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, would exert themselves now rather than months from now when the problem really comes to roost, to insist on rules of engagement, so to speak, so that you will, and the American people, and people around the world, will be able to know in real time what the legal skirmishing is in this case. That's a foretaste of things to come, but I think that's a very real issue that's going to come up. We assume in this day and age that we're going to have essentially immediate access to the governing documents, and that is going to be a challenge unless something changes in terms of Army policy. But this may be as good a time as any to take a second and describe the appellate process. Michelle, do you want to run through that briefly for people?
And we can use the Akbar case as an example, and then we can build on some of the other 4 individuals who are currently sitting on military's death row. The first level of appeals that happens after a court-martial finds an individual guilty of capital murder is actually a process called clemency, in which the convening authority or the commander who initiated the court-martial has the opportunity to wipe out the entire conviction, to mitigate the sentence. The military justice system is, as we've all heard, it's commander-driven. It's really the commander is in charge of the court-martial. And so the commander has the opportunity to say that the charges should be dismissed, or dismiss the charges themselves, actually, and get rid of the sentence. Now, certainly that's very rare that happens. The court-martial process is started for a reason, because the commander thinks that the individual has committed a crime. But after the clemency process, assuming that the commander does not decide to mitigate the sentence or the conviction, then it goes to the first level appeals, the service courts. And in the Akbar case, it is currently pending at the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the same court, the first level appellate court, that the Hassan case would go to, assuming that he gets convicted. And then from there, and anyone who gets a sentence of a year in confinement or punitive discharge, dishonorable discharge, bad conduct discharge, or in the case of an officer, a dismissal, gets the opportunity to appeal to that first level of court. The second level of appeals is the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. It's the highest military court, presided over by 5 civilian judges, and not every case is automatically appealable to the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. But I assume in a case of the charges that we're looking at here in the Fort Hood tragedy, that it would get to the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. And
it's mandatory for capital cases.
exactly.
If there's a capital sentence, it's mandatory review.
Right.
Yeah.
And assuming that is the case here, which all indications are that would be the case, then the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces would hear the case, and then there's the opportunity to go to the Supreme Court, which has not always been afforded to military members, and even now, one of the things that was a recommendation from the recent Cox Commission, and also a movement that has been afoot in Congress, is to expand jurisdiction so that military members whose cases are not heard by the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces can still make it to the United States Supreme Court, because civilian defendants are afforded that right, and believe that the military should get that.
Yeah, just a couple things I would add to that, and maybe it would have been more helpful for us to walk through the trial process so you kind of can see how the appellate process builds off of it. So maybe we'll just step a second back and to see that. Kind of the very first step of the process, the one that's already been initiated now, is the preferral of charges. So there's charges that are brought against a soldier. In this case, Major Hassan's been charged with counts. And what happens from there, those initial charges, the preferral of charges, there's a preliminary hearing that takes place. And that is, in the civilian world, there's a grand jury proceeding, which is closed and secret and private, and only the prosecutor takes part in it. In the military, it's very much it is a more open hearing, and that's, as Gene pointed out, press would be allowed to go to it, and it's a public hearing. And at that point, basically there's kind of a mini administrative hearing where evidence is presented by the government and the defense to make a recommendation to that commanding general of whether or not a criminal trial should go forward. And so after that Article 32 hearing takes place, a recommendation will go to the commanding general of what he should do with that case. And what I would point out here is along this step, what you can probably expect to see as a point of interest from the media, I would expect at some point here somebody will raise the issue of the sanity of Major Hassan. And so there's a process in the military under Rule 706 for a sanity hearing, for lack of a better word, kind of colloquially referred to as. And it basically is an opportunity to assess the competency of someone, whether he's competent and fit to stand trial. And that process will take place sometime along in this process. And just to kind of differentiate, that's different from the insanity defense, which might be raised at trial. So kind of the threshold question here is somebody fit to stand trial? And that would kind of go into the convening authorities and the commanding general's ultimate recommendation of, again, if he is going to refer this matter to a trial, because none of that would have happened at this early stages. So kind of as we mentioned, in other words, there will probably be a sanity hearing, which is between a board of civilians, including at least one psychiatrist, where they basically answer several questions. They look and say, does this person suffer from a mental illness? And if so, what is the clinical diagnosis of that illness? And then they ask, at the time he committed this act, what was his mental capacity? Did he have the ability to understand and appreciate what he did? And then at the present time now, what is his current mental capacity? Does he have the capacity to understand the proceedings against him and what is going on?
I think, Brian, you may have said a board of civilians. I think you meant board of physicians.
Physicians, excuse me. Yes, I'm sorry.
There might be a civilian physician on there.